Chapter 3 of Reed Anthony, Cowman, an Autobiography by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A second trip to Fort Sumner. On the return trip, we traveled mainly by night. The proceeds from the sale of the herd were in the wagon, and had this fact been known, it would have been a tempting prize for either bandits or Indians. After leaving Horsehead Crossing, we had the advantage of the dark of the moon, and it was a well-known fact that the Comanches usually choose moonlight nights for their marauding expeditions. Another thing in our favor, both going and returning, was the lightness of travel westward, it having almost ceased during the Civil War, though in '66 it showed a slight prospect of resumption. Small bands of Indians were still abroad on horse-stealing forays, but the rich prizes of wagon trains bound for El Paso or Santa Fe no longer tempted the noble red man in force. This was favorable wind to our sails, but these plainsmen drovers predicted that once traffic westward was resumed, the Comanche and his ally would be about the first ones to know it. The redskins were constantly passing back and forth to and from their reservation in the Indian Territory, and news travels fast, even among savages. We reached the Brazos River early in August. As the second start was not to be made until the latter part of the following month, a general settlement was made with the men, and all re-engaged for the next trip. I received $80 in gold as my portion, it being the first money I ever earned as a citizen. The past 2 months were a splendid experience for one going through a formative period, and I had returned feeling that I was once more a man among men. All the uncertainty as to my future had fallen from me, and I began to look forward to the day when I also might be the owner of lands and cattle. There was no good reason why I should not, as the range was as free as it was boundless. There were any quantity of wild cattle in the country awaiting an owner, and a good mount of horses, a rope, and a branding iron were all the capital required to start a brand. I knew the success which my father had made in Virginia before the war, and had seen it repeated on a smaller scale by my elder brother in Missouri. But here was a country which discounted both of those in rearing cattle without expense. Under the best reasoning at my command, I had reached the promised land, and henceforth determined to cast my fortunes with Texas. Rather than remain idle around the Loving headquarters for a month, I returned with George Edwards to his home. Altogether too cordial a welcome was extended us, but I repaid the hospitality of the ranch by relating our experiences of trail and Indian surprise. Miss Gertrude was as charming as ever, but the trip to Sumner and back had cooled my ardor, and I behaved myself as an acceptable guest should. The time passed rapidly, and on the last day of the month we returned to Belknap. Active preparations were in progress for the driving of the second herd. Oxen had been secured, and a number of extra fine horses were already added to the saddle stock. The remuda had enjoyed a good month's rest, and were in strong working flesh, and within a few days all the boys reported for duty. The senior member of the firm was the owner of a large number of range cattle, and it was the intention to round up and gather as many of his beeves as possible for the coming drive. We should have ample time to do this by waiting until the latter part of the month for starting. It was believed that few Indians would be encountered, as the time was nearing for their annual buffalo hunt for robes and a supply of winter meat. This was a gala occasion with the tribes which depended upon the bison for food and clothing, and as the natural hunting grounds of the Comanche and Kiowas lay south of Red River, the drovers considered that that would be an opportune time to start. The Indians would no doubt confine their operations to the first few tiers of counties in Texas, as the robes and dried meat would tax the carrying capacity of their horses returning, making it an object to kill their supplies as near their winter encampment as possible. Some 20 days were accordingly spent in gathering beeves along the main Brazos and Clear Fork. Our herd consisted of about 1,000 in the straight ranch brand, and after receiving and road branding 500 outside cattle, we were ready to start. 16 men constituted our numbers. The horses were culled down until but 5 were left to the man, and with the previous armament, the start was made. Never before or since have I enjoyed such an outing as this was until we struck the dry drive on approaching the Pecos River. The absence of the Indians was correctly anticipated, and either their presence elsewhere, preying on the immense buffalo herds, or the drift of the seasons, had driven countless numbers of that animal across our pathway. There were days and days that we were never out of sight of the feeding myriads of these shaggy brutes, and at night they became a menace to our sleeping herd. During the day, when the cattle were strung out in trail formation, we had difficulty in keeping the two species separated, but we shelled the buffalo right and left and moved forward. Frequently, when they occupied the country ahead of us, several men rode forward and scattered them on either hand until a right-of-way was effected for the cattle to pass. While they remained with us, we killed our daily meat from their numbers, and several of the boys secured fine robes. They were very gentle, but when occasion required, could give a horse a good race, bouncing along, lacking grace in flight. Our cook was a Negro. One day, as we were nearing Buffalo Gap, a number of big bulls, attracted by the covered wagon, approached the commissary, the canvas sheet of which shone like a white flag. The wagon was some distance in the rear, and as the buffalo began to approach it, they would scare and circle around, but constantly coming nearer the object of their curiosity. The darky finally became alarmed for fear that they would gore his oxen, and unearthed an old Creedmoor rifle which he carried in the wagon. The gun could be heard for miles, and when the cook opened up on the playful denizens of the plain, a number of us hurried back, supposing it was an Indian attack. When within a quarter mile of the wagon and the situation became clear, we took it more leisurely, but the fusillade never ceased until we rode up and it dawned on the darky's mind that rescue was at hand. He had halted his team, and from a secure position in the front end of the wagon had shot down a dozen buffalo bulls. Pure curiosity and the blood of their comrades had kept them within easy range of the murderous Creedmoor, and the frenzied Negro, supposing that his team might be attacked at any moment, had mown down a circle of the innocent animals. We charged and drove away the remainder, after which we formed a guard of honor in escorting the commissary until its timid driver overtook the herd. The last of the buffalo passed out of sight before we reached the headwaters of the Concho. In crossing the dry drive approaching the Pecos, we were unusually fortunate. As before, we rested in advance of starting, and on the evening of the second day out, several showers fell, cooling the atmosphere until the night was fairly chilly. The rainfall continued all the following day in a gentle mist, and with little or no suffering to man or beast, early in the afternoon we entered the cañon known as Castle Mountain Gap, and the dry drive was virtually over. Horsehead Crossing was reached early the next morning, the size of the herd making it possible to hold it compactly and thus preventing any scattering along that stream. There had been no freshets in the river since June, and the sandy sediment had solidified, making a safe crossing for both herd and wagon. After the usual rest of a few days, the herd trailed up the Pecos with scarcely any incident worthy of mention. Early in November, we halted some distance below Fort Sumner, where we were met by Mr. Loving, who had gone on to the post in our advance, with the report that other cattle had just been accepted and that there was no prospect of an immediate delivery. In fact, The outlook was anything but encouraging, unless we wintered ours and had them ready for the first delivery in the spring. The herd was accordingly turned back to Bosque Grande on the river, and we went into permanent quarters. There was a splendid winter range all along the Pecos, and we loose herded the beeves or rode lines in holding them in the different bends of the river, some of which were natural enclosures. There was scarcely any danger of Indian molestations during the winter months, and with the exception of a few severe northers which swept down the valley, the cattle did comparatively well. Tents were secured at the post, corn was purchased for our saddle mules, and except during storms, little or no privation was experienced during the winter in that southern climate. Wood was plentiful in the grove in which we were encamped, and a huge fireplace was built out of clay and sticks in the end of each tent, assuring us comfort against the elements. The monotony of existence was frequently broken by the passing of trading caravans, both up and down the river. There was a fair trade with the interior of Mexico, as well as with various settlements along the Rio Grande, and towns in northern New Mexico. When other means of diversion failed, we had recourse to Sumner, where a sutler's bar and gambling games flourished. But the most romantic traveler to arrive or pass during the winter was Captain Burleson, late of the Confederacy. As a sportsman, the captain was a gem of the first water, carrying with him, beside a herd of nearly 1,000 cattle, 3 racehorses, several baskets of fighting chickens, and a pack of hounds. He had a large Mexican outfit in charge of his cattle, which were in bad condition on their arrival in March, having drifted about all winter, gambling, racing his horses, and fighting his chickens. The herd represented his winnings. As we had nothing to match, all we could offer was our hospitality. Captain Burleson went into camp below us on the river and remained our neighbor until we rounded up and broke camp in the spring. He had been as far west as El Paso during the winter, and was then drifting north in hope of finding a market for his herd. We indulged in many hunts, and I found him the true gentleman and sportsman in every sense of the word. As I recall him now, he was a lovable vagabond, and for years afterwards stories were told around Fort Sumner of his wonderful nerve as a poker player. Early in April, an opportunity occurred for a delivery of cattle to the post. Ours were the only beeves in sight, those of Captain Burleson not qualifying, and a roundup was made and the herd tendered for inspection. Only 800 were received, which was quite a disappointment to the drovers, as at least 90% of the tender filled every qualification. The motive in receiving the few soon became apparent, when a stranger appeared and offered to buy the remaining 700 at a ridiculously low figure. But the drovers had grown suspicious of the contractors and receiving agent, and declining the offer, went back and bought the herd of Captain Burleson. Then throwing the two contingents together and boldly announcing their determination of driving to Colorado, they started the herd out past Fort Sumner with every field glass in the post leveled on us. The military requirements of Sumner for its own and Indian use were well known to the drovers, and a scarcity of beef was certain to occur at that post before other cattle could be bargained for and arrive. My employers had evidently figured out the situation to a nicety, for during the forenoon of the second day out from the fort we were overtaken by the contractors. Of course, they threw on the government inspector all the blame for the few cattle received, and offered to buy 500 or 600 more out of the herd. But the shoe was on the other foot now, the drovers acting as independently as the proverbial hog on ice. The herd never halted, the contractors followed up, and when we went into camp that evening, a trade was closed on 1,000 steers at $2 a head advance over those which were received but a few days before. The oxen were even reserved, and after delivering the beeves at Sumner, we continued on northward with a remnant, nearly all of which were the Burleson cattle. The latter part of April we arrived at the Colorado line. There we were halted by the authorities of that territory under some act of quarantine against Texas cattle. We went into camp on the nearest water, expecting to prove that our little herd had wintered at Fort Sumner and were therefore immune from quarantine, when buyers arrived from Trinidad, Colorado. The steers were a mixed lot, running from a yearling to big, rough 4- and 5-year-olds, and when Goodnight returned from Sumner with a certificate attested to by every officer of that post showing that the cattle had wintered north of latitude 34, a trade was closed at once, even the oxen going in at the phenomenal figures of $150 a yoke. We delivered the herd near Trinidad, going into that town to outfit before returning. The necessary alterations were made to the wagon, mules were harnessed in, and we started home in gala spirits. In a little over 30 days, my employers had more than doubled their money on the Burleson cattle and were naturally jubilant. The proceeds of the Trinidad sale were carried in the wagon returning, though we had not as yet collected for the second delivery at Sumner. The songs of the birds mixed with our own as we traveled homeward, and the freshness of early summer on the primitive land as it rolled away in dips and swells made the trip a delightful outing. Fort Sumner was reached within a week, where we halted a day and then started on, having in the wagon a trifle over $50,000 in gold and silver. At Sumner, 2 men made application to accompany us back to Texas, and as they were well armed and mounted, and numbers were an advantage, they were made welcome. Our winter camp at Bas Grande was passed with but a single glance as we dropped down the Pecos Valley at the rate of 40 miles a day. Little or no travel was encountered en route, nor was there any sign of Indian until the afternoon of our reaching Horsehead Crossing. While passing Dagger Bend, 4 miles above the ford, Goodnight and a number of us boys were riding several hundred yards in advance of the wagon, telling stories of old sweethearts. The road made a sudden bend around some sand hills, and the advance guard had passed out of sight of the rear when a fresh Indian trail was cut, and as we reined in our mounts to examine the sign, we were fired on. The rifle shots, followed by a flight of arrows, passed over us, and we took to shelter like flushed quail. I was riding a good saddle horse and bolted off on the opposite side of the road from the shooting, but in the scattering which ensued, a number of mules took down the road. One of the 2 men picked up at the post was a German whose mule stampeded after his mates, and who received a galling fire from the concealed Indians, the rest of us turning to the nearest shelter. With the exception of this one man, all of us circled back through the mesquite brush and reached the wagon, which had halted. Meanwhile, the shooting had attracted the men behind, who charged through the sand dunes, flanking the Indians, who immediately decamped. Security of the remuda and wagon was a first consideration, and danger of ambush prevented our men from following up the redskins. Order was soon restored, and we proceeded, shortly meeting the young German coming back up the road, who merely remarked on meeting us, "Dem Injuns shot at me." The Indians had evidently not been expecting us. From where they turned out and where the attack was made, we back-trailed them in the road for nearly a mile. They had simply heard us coming, and supposing that the advance guard was all there was in the party, had made the attack and were in turn themselves surprised at our numbers. But the warning was henceforth heeded, and on reaching the crossing, more Indian sign was detected. Several large parties had evidently crossed the river that morning, and were no doubt at that moment watching us from the surrounding hills. The cañon of Castle Mountain Gap was well adapted for an Indian ambush, and as it was only 12 miles from the ford to its mouth, we halted within a short distance of the entrance, as if encamping for the night. All the horses under saddle were picketed fully a quarter mile from the wagon. Easy marks for the poor low, and the remuda was allowed to wander at will, an air of perfect carelessness prevailing in the camp. From the sign which we had seen that day, there was little doubt but there were in the neighborhood of 500 Indians in the immediate vicinity of Horsehead Crossing, and we did everything we could to create the impression that we were tenderfeet. But with the falling of darkness, every horse was brought in, and we harnessed up and started, leaving the fire burning to identify our supposed camp. The drovers gave our darky cook instructions, in case of an attack while passing through the gap, never to halt his team, but push ahead for the plain. About 1/3 of us took the immediate lead of the wagon, the remuda following closely, and the remainder of the men bringing up the rear. The moon was on the wane and would not rise until nearly midnight, and for the first few miles, or until we entered the cañon, there was scarce a sound to disturb the stillness of the night. The sandy road even muffled the noise of the wagon and the tramping of horses. But once we entered that rocky cañon, the rattling of our commissary seemed to summon every Comanche and his ally to come and rob us. There was never a halt, the reverberations of our caravan seeming to re-echo through the gap, resounding forward and back until our progress must have been audible at Horsehead Crossing. But the expected never happens, and within an hour we reached the summit of the plain, where the country was open and clear, and an attack could have been easily repelled. 4 fresh mules had been harnessed in for the night, and striking a free gait, we put 20 miles of that arid stretch behind us before the moon rose. A short halt was made after midnight for a change of teams and saddle horses, and then we continued our hurried travel until near dawn. Some indistinct objects in our front caused us to halt. It looked like a caravan, and we hailed it without reply. Several of us dismounted and crept forward, but the only sign of life was a dull buzzing sound which seemed to issue from an outfit of parked wagons. The report was laid before the 2 drovers, who advised that we await the dawn, which was then breaking, as it was possible that the caravan had been captured and robbed by Indians. A number of us circled around to the farther side, and as we again approached the wagons in the uncertain light, we hailed again and received in reply a shot which cut off the upper lobe of one of the boys' ears. We hugged the ground for some little time, until the presence of our outfit was discovered by the lone guardian of the caravan, who welcomed us. He apologized, saying that on awakening he supposed we were Indians, not having heard our previous challenge, and fired on us under the impulse of the moment. He was a well-known trader by the name of Honey Allen, and was then on his way to El Paso, having pulled out on the dry stretch about 25 miles and sent his oxen back to water. His present cargo consisted of pecans, honey, and a large number of colonies of live bees, the latter having done the buzzing on our first reconnoiter. At his destination, so he informed us, the pecans would be worth 50 cents a quart, the honey $1 a pound, and the bees $100 a hive. After repairing the damaged ear, we hurried on, finding Allen's oxen lying around the water on our arrival. I met him several years afterward in Denver, Colorado, dressed to kill, barbered, and highly perfumed. He had just sold 1,800 2-year-old steers and had $25,000 in the bank. "Son, let me tell you something," said he, as we were taking a drink together. "That Pecos country was a dangerous region to pick up an honest living in. I'm going back to God's country, back where there ain't no Injuns." Yet Allen died in Texas. There was a charm in that frontier that held men captive. I always promised myself to return to Virginia to spend the declining years of my life, but the fulfillment never came. I can now realize how idle was the expectation, having seen others make the attempt and fail. I recall the experience of an old cowman, laboring under a similar delusion, who after nearly half a century in the Southwest concluded to return to the scenes of his boyhood. He had made a substantial fortune in cattle and had fought his way through the vicissitudes of the frontier until success crowned his efforts. A large family had in the meantime grown up around him, and under the pretense of giving his children the advantages of an older and established community, he sold his holdings and moved back to his native borough. Within 6 months he returned to the straggling village which he had left on the plains, bringing the family with him. Shortly afterwards I met him and anxiously inquired the cause of his return. "Well, Reed," said he, "I can't make you understand near as well as though you had tried it yourself. You see, I was a stranger in my native town. The people were all right, I reckon, but I found out that it was me who had changed. I tried to be sociable with 'em, but honest, Reed, I just couldn't stand it in a country where no one ever asked you to take a drink." A week was spent in crossing the country between the Concho and Brazos rivers. Not a day passed but Indian trails were cut, all heading southward, and on a branch of the Clear Fork we nearly ran afoul of an encampment of 40 teepees and lean-tos, with several hundred horses in sight. But we never varied our course a fraction, passing within a quarter-mile of their camp, apparently indifferent as to whether they showed fight or allowed us to pass in peace. Our bluff had the desired effect, but we made it an object to reach Fort Griffin near midnight before camping. The Comanche and his ally were great respecters not only of their own physical welfare, but of the Henry and Spencer rifle with which the white man killed the buffalo at the distance of twice the flight of an arrow. When every advantage was in his favor, ambush and surprise, Lowe was a warrior bold. Otherwise he used discretion. End of chapter 3.